Hey everyone, Social Solipsist here for another episode of 52 and 52, and this week on the show I am taking a look at Metal Gear Rising: Revengeance, which is a spin-off game in the Metal Gear series, or the Metal Gear Solid series, that I have had for a while, or at least had my eye on for a while, and I picked it up maybe a year ago or something like that. Never played it, even though I really wanted to. And I finally got around to playing some of it. So Metal Gear Rising: Revengeance is a character action slash hack and slash style game. It's certainly a departure from the mainline Metal Gear Solid series, although that should be abundantly clear. It's a game that was, I think, commissioned probably in whole by Konami, and it's made by Platinum. Fuck Konami, by the way, if that wasn't abundantly clear from previous videos. And yeah. But Platinum is a fantastic company that I have a huge amount of respect for. They make some of the very best character action battle systems in all of gaming, I would say. They have made quite a number of games, and their predecessor, Clover, the studio that basically existed as Platinum before Platinum existed, also made a number of really excellent and very unique games. But they've made a number of games on their own, and also been commissioned to make battle systems for a number of other games. And even in the games where they are only on contract to build the combat system, they really do some pretty excellent work. Games like there's a Transformers game recently and a Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles game recently, which were both fairly critically panned, but the combat systems themselves worked as well as could be expected for fairly poor cash-ins. And this game is really no exception to having these fantastic combat systems that Platinum makes. Platinum's combat systems, if you're not familiar, do a really great job of sort of blurring the line between the two extremes, I would say, in character action combat systems. You've got the ones where they're not very flashy, but they're very solid, and as a result of not being very flashy, they're kind of unsatisfying in terms of the combat. But on the opposite side, you have ones that are all shine and polish and no substance. So you're really just hammering one button and watching what happens on screen. And Platinum historically has done a great job of kind of mixing the two and making sure there's depth there, but it also looks and feels just really great. And again, this is no exception to that rule. I would say that this is one of their more simplified combat systems relative to, say, Bayonetta or something like that. It's a fairly limited control scheme, although not in a particularly negative way. It's really, I think they built it in a lot of ways to be friendly to people who are not familiar with the character action genre, particularly people who really love Metal Gear Solid, but may not be abundantly familiar with character action. I think the crossover between the genre and the MGS fandom may be fairly small. So I think they did a really good job of basically building a fairly simplified version that still feels really great. It's, like I said, it's fairly simple. It's basically light and heavy attacks, a run and a dodge, and a directional parry. But that doesn't mean that there isn't, a lot of depth in there that can be gained by, getting good at those couple of simple things. Good timing and good strategy count for a lot. Things like the parry are a little bit tricky at first because it is a directional parry that you control with the stick. But after, probably an hour of, as long as you're diligent and not just ignoring the mechanic entirely, things like that it's a little weird, but you'll get used to it pretty fast. Even with the tutorials, some aspects of the gameplay, the way to play the engine is, or the way to play the combat system that is it can be a little bit obtuse. They have what they call VR missions, which basically operate as a tutorial. Much of it is optional to even play, but regardless of whether you play it or not, there are some aspects of it that they leave out. Things like the lock-on, it's in the controls list, but I don't believe in any of the initial tutorials it's ever detailed what it is or how it works. And not using the lock-on can make combat a lot harder. Generally speaking, like I said, the combat feels great. However, there are a few issues with some things. For example, the camera control can sometimes be aggressively taken away from the player. Basically, if they want you to really see a set piece or something like that, say there's something flying over or something across, there's something over there we want you to look at, and sometimes it will grab the camera away from you and make you look at that thing, even if you're in the middle of something, without regarding whether you may be busy, running or even in combat. And so that can be a little bit frustrating. It's a fairly minor thing, and it doesn't happen so frequently that I'm really irritated by it. And I think as you get deeper into the game, it does decrease the frequency with which they do that. But that doesn't change the fact that suddenly having the camera control yanked out of your control is a little bit irritating. Likewise, the lock-on can be a bit finicky. Like I said, not using the lock-on can make combat a lot harder. But if you're fighting things that are particularly tall or flying or something like that, and you do have the lock-on on and you're getting close to them, the camera can go a little bit weird. It's a pretty hard lock-on, and doesn't take into account a whole lot. It doesn't give a lot of soft camera control. It doesn't control the camera in a way. Basically, if you're fighting somebody who's flying and they're right above you, the camera is going to have a bad time. It's not going to zoom over you or over on top from a bird's eye view or anything like that. It's going to stare straight up at them, and as a result, you sometimes can't really see what you're doing. So there's some minor camera issues with the lock-on as well. Because of I'll get to it in a bit, but because there's some issues with the gamepad mapping, the button that they've chosen to map the lock-on to is the right bumper, and when you're trying to use the ninja mode, which is on right trigger, and then flip the lock-on on and off, that can get a little bit frustrating trying to do that on the fly. But I digress. I'll get into the controls in a minute. Anti-air in general, I think fighting characters that are in the air is a little bit unpleasant. Raiden as a character doesn't really have any specific tools for anti-air. There are secondary weapons that you can use, like rockets and things like that, to put those guys in a stagger state or knock them out of the air entirely. But they're fairly rare on the whole, and if you don't use them properly, you're just out. They don't keep spawning on the map or anything like that for you to pick up more of them. And unlike Dante or Bayo or other characters in typical character action games, he doesn't have any really inherent anti-air abilities. He doesn't have the same sort of vertical leap that characters like Dante and Bayo have. Because as weird as it is to say about the Metal Gear Solid series, this is a game that's more grounded in real world physics and that sort of stuff. So him jumping 20 feet into the air even with him being a cyborg, it's not really consistent with what they want to build for the world, and so he doesn't have that. As a result, you have to often use kind of platforming, and they do, the game or the level design is good enough that you can use they always build the platforming to give you that anti-air reach. But precision platforming with the way the controls operate is a little bit tricky, especially if you're using ninja mode or something like that and you're running around really fast. You often fall off of stuff, that sort of thing. And so it can get a little bit frustrating and break up the pace of otherwise really pleasant combat. But can often break up the flow of a fight enough to sort of pull you out of the situation, and it's not the best way to handle that. I would have preferred, I don't know. He does have a knife on him that, honestly, if they had that as like a secondary weapon, if you don't have a secondary weapon on you and he just like chucks the knife, that would have been enough, I think, to give an in-world explanation for how he gets some additional anti-air ability. But that's neither here or there. That's just me spouting nonsense. Moving on from that, there's enough depth, certainly, to the combat systems and the additional like secondary systems with resource management and that sort of thing, to add a lot of depth to the whole the gameplay as a whole, without damaging damaging the balance of the complexity. You never feel like you're overwhelmed by the number of options you have, but you also never feel too much like you weren't given the right tools for the job. Again, the whole platforming thing to do anti-air is a little bit frustrating, but the tools are still there. In general, the combat is, like I said, obviously the combat systems are really great, but the boss battles in particular are interesting, and they're well thought out, and they're unique characters. Obviously, they're Metal Gear Solid characters, so they're wacky and fun, and you never really know what you're going to run into. But again, Raiden always has the tools to deal with them, and props to them for building a simple system that they can throw a lot of things at you, and the combat all still works. As long as you have a good grasp on those core mechanics. Moving on to the story a little bit, because it is a Metal Gear Solid game, I would say the story is equally or more wacky than a lot of the Metal Gear Solid games, both mainline and spin-off stuff, things on the PSP and stuff like that. Of all the characters in the universe that don't have, a focus, I think Raiden definitely deserved his own game. You could argue, obviously, that Metal Gear Solid 2 is Raiden's game, but I would say that it's not. You can easily swap out Raiden for Snake in Metal Gear Solid 2, and it basically makes no difference, minus some minor story elements. Spoilers for an old ass game that I shouldn't have to put a spoiler thing on anyway. Unfortunately, story wise, a lot of the sort of plot related direction that you get from your the characters that you work with, the NPCs on your team, is delivered through the Gears of War style, like hold your finger to your ear dialogue. It's totally uninterruptible, and you move even slower than you did in Metal Gear Solid, or sorry, not Metal Gear Solid, Gears of War. And the Gears of War one never really bothered me because you could still move, and you never felt like you were, in the middle of doing something. But in this game, they'll interrupt you at some pretty random times. It's not like they talk to you immediately after a fight. Sometimes you finish a fight, run down a hallway, are just about to like go through some doorways or something like that. It's not like scripted. It's not railroaded in the scripting hard enough to like take that control away from you, and that can be irritating on its own as well. It's not extensive. They don't do it super often. It's, a couple of times a level. But it does kind of cripple the pacing, because this Raiden is a fast ninja character who's always on the move, always looking to do the next thing. It really does kind of feel weird for him to be stopping to take orders. And on top of that, like, the in-universe reasoning for it doesn't make any sense either. He's a cyborg from the future. He doesn't need to hold an earpiece, and he doesn't need to stand still to take orders from people. And I understand they want you to look at the videos of the NPCs' faces that are talking to you. But there's no reason why they couldn't do something like, say, have him stop and listen and watch, and then also have the ability for you to turn off, basically Raiden in world says, I don't need to see you, I need to keep moving, but still listen and respond. He's not incompetent, he's not a one-track mind type of guy. He can, move through an area without having to dedicate all of his focus to talking to his team members. So even in world, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense. I understand, mechanically why they've done it, for the sake of, not having you get to the next thing too quickly or something like that. But that's not really even an argument either, simply because at the end of the day, they could have designed the levels differently so that, you can't get to the next thing. They could add more aspects to the level design that don't let you progress further than the person who is talking to you wants you to at the time, if that makes any sense at all. I don't feel like I've articulated that well enough, but maybe it'll come through. That said, and with that gripe in mind, the codec is fantastic. The codec conversations, similar to the ones you would have in the rest of the Metal Gear Solid games, are really extensive. They're fairly well written on the whole. They're interesting, and they add a lot of depth to the world. I am a little bit bummed that they are sort of hidden in a sub-menu. It's not hard to find, and the game does prompt you to go there once. But the fact that you could basically go through most or all of the game without listening to any of those is really a shame. Because there's a lot of content there, and it's all, fully voice acted, and I would compliment it in much the same way. I think I've said before on the channel my appreciation for the codec, or whatever the term it is they use in the Mass Effect series. Basically, the encyclopedia that you can go into and has extensive details on the world. And even, it's voice acted and read out to you. I've always complimented Mass Effect for that, and I think this falls in many of the same places in terms of, it's not the optimal way to deliver all of that world building information, but it's a very good way to strike a balance between people like me who love the world building and people who just want to go through and have the gameplay alone and don't really care too much about the world. So props to them for doing all that work. Moving on to the actual build of the game itself. Graphically, it does pretty nicely with a limited amount of graphical complexity and resources. I mean, it runs on DX9, and it's a game that's a couple of years old at this point. But generally speaking, it's quite good looking given what they built. My only real gripe on that front is with the cutscenes, which appear to be rendered at probably about 720p, and they are compressed all to hell. This isn't totally out of the ordinary, but it's always disappointing to see. It's not only really compressed, but it's got film grain on top of it, which makes everything look really kind of gross. And even if you have subtitles on, even the subtitles are, they're all grainy around the edges. It might be the most glaring thing in the cutscenes is you look at these subtitles and they're aliased all to hell. They're all choppy around the edge, and it's just kind of ugly. And it's a shame. I think in general, I'd like to see the games industry, at least on PC, always have the option to say, hey, I'm willing to sacrifice an extra 5 gigs of download and hard drive space for the sake of, the higher quality renders of these cutscenes or something like that. Because I totally understand, especially on consoles where there may be limited storage and stuff like that they have to cut some corners. But I'd rather see that higher quality cutscene. But it's sort of a minor gripe at the end of the day. Moving on from the graphics, I guess, combat-wise, as good as the engine is, as good as the combat systems are, the mouse and keyboard controls are fairly middling at best. They can be remapped, but at the end of the day, there's not a whole lot of ways to fix some of the inherent control issues. I'm still one of those guys who wants the nice mix between the benefits of a mouse and keyboard and the benefits of a controller joystick with analog control and all that stuff. I may in fact have a solution for that I may test out in the foreseeable future, but if I ever do that, I'll post a video about it. But yeah, in the meantime, the mouse and keyboard controls are fairly middling. I think you can get past them. They're not as bad as, say, something like Dark Souls 1 with a mouse and keyboard. But it's certainly not the optimal way to play this game. Actually, my biggest gripe about the mouse and keyboard controls is that they did not allow me to map anything to the extra buttons on my mouse. I have a mouse with 6 buttons on it, and only the mouse button 1, left mouse button, right mouse button, and the scroll wheel worked. Literally everything else, if I tried to remap anything to it, which really would have made the biggest difference to me, just straight up did not take the input. Which I think this is honestly the first game I've ever seen that be the case for. And it wasn't even, they didn't have an icon for it. It straight up did not recognize the input at all. So that was pretty surprising. So as a result, I am playing with a controller. Playing with the controller works quite well. Obviously this was, a console release as well. So, having being able to use a controller on it is kind of key. And my only gripe about the controller scheme is that basically there's, if you want to remap anything on the controller, you really can't. They give 4 predefined control schemes that you can flip between, similar to the presets that a lot of console games have. But in terms of remapping single buttons or anything like that, that's not an option. And as I was saying earlier in the video, having the Ninja Run mapped right next to the lock-on is not optimal, especially when there are buttons not being. I think there are some buttons that aren't even being used on the controller. I think my specific thought at the time was I wish I could remap the lock-on to R3 or L3 or something like that. And because that's not an option, it's a little bit frustrating, and I really wish that was there, and I think it would have improved things a lot, for me at least. Other people, it may not bother them at all. There may be enough variation. As far as a general port goes, it's not the worst. Like I said, it is, a little bit older at this point. And it is running on, DX9 and all that. But generally speaking, the graphical options are definitely there in terms of, your resolutions, your additional, shading and anti-aliasing and all that is definitely there, and it works great. And I always have to point out that it does not make you restart the game. Any game that makes you restart to change the graphical options is infuriating. Don't do that. The only excuse for ever doing that is if you're actually changing the rendering engine, like from DirectX 9 to DirectX 10 or something like that. That is the only excuse. Don't do that. Anyway, so they do, they do have all those graphical options there, and they do change on the fly, and that I appreciate. But there are definitely still some kind of relics of it being a port. The UX stuff, for example, a lot of it is still not built to be navigated with a mouse and keyboard. Is very clearly, this UX was built to be controlled with a controller, and if you try anything else, it's a little bit wonky. But I go into the menus so infrequently that it's neither here nor there. So on the whole, as much as I have a lot of nitpicks about the game, I'm having a really enjoyable time with the game. I've gotten a few hours in, fought a few, boss fights and things like that. I've actually seen the game all the way through before, so I'm fully aware of what the story is like, all the content therein. But it's certainly, even despite my having seen that before, it's worth the combat system and all of that it's worth playing. I think if you are not an MGS fan and think poorly on the MGS series, then fair enough. It may not be your cup of tea, even if you'd like a good, character action combat system. But one way or another, I think it's an entry. It's a solid entry worthy of the MGS moniker. And I think it's a solid game on the whole as a standalone as well. As long as you can, put up with your typical MGS cheese and wackiness, I think you'll have a pretty good time with it. So yeah, again, I think they've built something that on the whole is fairly friendly to novice character action players, and I don't know if it'll stand the test of time, but it's certainly a good entry. So I have been the Social Solipsist. Thank you guys all for watching. Something I'm going to add to my outro sequence is, please leave a comment. If you are watching these videos, I would love to have a comment from you. I don't care if you like or subscribe or whatever else, although that would be great. But if you leave a comment, it lets me know you were here and that you watched the video, and give me any feedback you want, even if it's, boy, this sucked. So I appreciate it one way or another. So thank you guys very much for watching. See you guys next time. And remember, fuck Konami.